today we're talking about Hank Rearden, a continued talk about Hank Rearden and
All
his
right. Thank
psychology.
you, Dr. Ken. And I'm Andrew Bernstein. I am the disclaimer guy. And so, if you haven't read Atlas Shrugged, read it. That's, like yesterday. But but read it first before my recommendation. And I think Dr. Ken and Dr. Milgram would agree here. Read it first because there'll be a lot of spoilers. It's a mystery story, great plot. You don't want to, we don't want to spoil the mystery for you. So read the book first and then watch the series. That's my advice.
Right. It's the best book I have ever read. It's the most life-changing book for me. And and I grew so much in it. I went from being a shy semi-altruist to loving my life. So if you want to love your life, don't listen to the series until you've read Atlas Shrugged, to put positively, read Atlas Shrugged and then come back and listen to this. Um, as I've said earlier, and on other ones, I would kill anybody who would spoil the plot for me of Atlas Shrugged. So not literally, obviously. So anyway, let's go back to Hank Rearden, revisit him, and we're going to look at a few things today. The first will be his relationship with Francisco, and then we will dive into the romance scenes or romance, his struggle and with romance with Dagny, and then we will move on to the wet nurse and maybe more. I'm sure there'll be more. So I'll start with Francisco. And Francisco is at the anniversary party, and we talked about this briefly before. And Rearden has escaped to this window after a woman was talking to him about her psychic experiences. And he's looking at the party and he's loving the fact he never loved his home, but he's loving that it looks gay, even though it only looks gay. It isn't a nice place because Lillian's vicious and she's invited every enemy and hater of values to this party, hater of Hank Rearden. So the person he seems to hate most is a playboy, a person like Francisco who has wasted his life with his inheritance and his great mind. He's thrown it away to become a playboy. And who enters the scene? Francisco. So Francisco actually goes up to Rearden and he says, "Permit me to introduce myself." And it's this authentic respect that he has. And Rearden's thinking is the action of naming an issue rather than evading it. It's the sudden relief that Rearden remains silent. And in some way, Francisco is acknowledging his own dignity in Rearden. And Rearden says, Hank says, "You want to speak to me to make me lose money?" And Francisco says, "Yes, eventually." And he says, "James came to me, you won't." He said, "If you understand that, then we have a basis for conversation." So Francisco, I'm going to cut out a lot, but he said, "It's a terrible night for an animal caught unprotected on that plane. They're looking out the window on a very stormy night. One should appreciate the meaning of being a man." And that's when Hank says, "You told me what I was thinking just a while ago, only I didn't have the words for it." So you're getting the theme that Francisco is there to give Hank the words to help him in the moral conflict that he's suffering through. And he said, "Shall I tell you the rest of the words?" Rearden says, "Go ahead." "For the greatest pride, you have summer flowers and naked women, or half naked women." He's not the playboy. um, he said, "If it weren't for you, most of them, would be left helpless." And it was not his thoughts, but his personal, most hidden emotions that Rearden had never confessed, that Francisco is helping him see. And it's just this incredible visibility. And he said, this is where he said, "They have a weapon against you, a terrible one. Ask yourself what it is sometime." And Rearden says, "Where do you see any evidence of it?" And he said, "In the unforgivable fact that you're as unhappy as you are." So he also says, "This is a battle in which one must make one's stance clear." So Francisco is there to help Hank see the error he's making. And Andy, take it from there.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. First of all, I mean, the Francisco Danconia is just he's a giant. I mean, all the heroes of Atlas Shrugged are, but Francisco is truly extraordinary. I mean, he's brilliant and he's physically gifted. We were talking about the tennis match, you know, when we were discussing Dagny. That might literally have been the first time Francisco was ever defeated at anything in his entire life.
By his choice.
Yeah, well, he contributes to it, but I think Dagny contributes a lot to it also. But yeah, he contributed to his loss. But he's just extraordinary, and he's this extraordinary businessman, enormously productive. He's brilliant philosophically. I mean, so he's like the total package, which is why it's so dismaying to Dagny, who's been in love with him since he was a kid, when he evidently becomes a playboy. But so he comes to Rearden, and it's the relationship they have is a mentoring one. This is what's interesting because he's a lot younger. Rearden's the older man, and normally we think of a mentor as being the older guy, teaching wisdom to the younger guy. But here it's different, and it parallels the Rourke-Wynand relationship in the Fountainhead, because Rourke is the younger man, Wynand is the older guy, but it's Rourke who's teaching Wynand, or trying to, about not selling your soul, about not being a power luster and a second hander. Rourke's attempt to rescue Wynand ultimately tragically fails, but Francisco's attempt to rescue Rearden from his philosophic errors is a resounding success. And it's so great. Rearden and Francisco, by the end of the novel, these guys love each other. I mean, it's not a romantic relationship, and it doesn't make up for the loss of Dagny for either of them. Nevertheless, it's an enormous value the way Rearden and Francisco love each other. There's just the way Rourke and Wynand do, and it's fascinating that Ayn Rand shows it in two different novels, in different forms. One successful and one ultimately unsuccessful, but she shows these these same gender non-romantic love relationships, and it's really moving. It's the way these men love each other. They're more than brothers here. They're they're soulmates. And anyway, so what was I saying before that in one of the earlier episodes that Francisco Danconia here is a professor of moral philosophy? Yeah, that's exactly what he is a professor of philosophy. I don't want to keep repeating myself, but he teaches Rearden to objectively judge what the altruist ethics is, the weapon that the looches and the mooters, to combine the two, the looters and the moochers, the weapon that they have against him, and how to liberate himself from their grip, and how to be able to protect himself and defend himself. And Professor Danconia does an outstanding job, and Hank Green is a very, very good student.
So
I think that's what I think you're completely right about the mentoring relationship. And what's especially dramatic, and I think we see it right here from the opening scene, is that Rearden wants to learn, but he also really wants someone who gets it. And so it's not it's not a sexual relationship, but it's like love. It is a kind of love. Dagny even says, "You've fallen for him, haven't you?" Right? She says that because he looks at him and he can't quite believe that this person he knows things about is saying these things that speak to his soul. And Rearden, who his family, they think that he's got no feelings. They think he's got no friends. But well, for one thing, he does have business colleagues and people who respect him, and the people who work for him. But also, when he finds someone he can get more from, he jumps at that. And of course, with Dagny, we'll talk about that later. But he's understood by her in a number of ways. I think we're gonna kind of keep talking about Francisco teaching him, but I think it's also very powerful that Ken Danaher, when he disappears and he feels a loss, and he thinks of the hours that he didn't give to Ken Danaher and gave to his family instead, and that this was now Ken Danaher is not Francisco, but he's something like that also, and that he's he was ready to go, and as which Galt knew about, because Dagny figured out that she was worried. She's got to go get to Ken Danaker, and Dagny told Eddie, and Eddie, as is his custom, spilled the beans to John Galt, and then John Galt got to Ken Danaker first. So that's sort of how that works. But Ken Danaker and Francis, and he's sort of like another version of Francisco, except he's not a persuader, but he's someone who understood and accepted what it meant to stop being on the side of the looters and to stop supporting his destroyers, and left. And
just one point here, Shoshana, and we can come back. But with that whole scene that you're just talking about, where Hank is thinking the hours that he gave to his family, he could have given them to Ken Danaker. That resonated so much with me, and I'm sure with most readers, because you make choices on how you spend every hour of your day, week, and life. And you want to make sure that you're filling it with people who bring you values. And sometimes you can't avoid it. But that helped me be much more discriminating in my life. And that's a gift that Hank gave us, when he realizes that he could have, all of this crappy time spent with his family could have been spent for him. So that's another, it could have been spent with people like Dagny or Ken Danaker. So very, very good point.
Well, I think also the reason it's in my head when we were talking about Hank and Francisco is that when Francisco showed up at Hank's office and said, you must be having a hard time having to damn the man who meant most to you.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And then, well,
you want to say who it is?
Yeah. And Rearden sort of thinks he's talking about Francisco, and Francisco realizes that that's what Hank thinks anyway. Right. So that's kind of cute. It's one time when Francisco couldn't quite read his mind.
Right. But also that scene where Hank Rearden wants to go upstairs, it's almost like that romantic relationship. He wants to go up in the Wayne Falkland to visit Francisco, and he's trying to hold back and wait. And then he's like a woman wanting to, Andy, you can take it from here, but to go see Francisco upstairs and talk with him as, a companion.
Yeah. He loves Francisco. Again, it's not a romantic relationship, but he loves him. But go back to the point, Shoshana, you were making when, and Rearden says to Francisco, "I wouldn't damn you if you would just leave me alone,"
Yes.
and then Francisco says, "I was speaking of, Ken Danaker," and Rearden realizes, they both realize, at that point, it's out in the open, how much Rearden loves Francisco, and again, the strikers, the leading strikers, Rearden is their symbol. He's their emblem. He's the great industrialist who makes material prosperity on earth, human prosperity possible, and he's been damned, and he's been criticized, and he's been persecuted, and they want to liberate him from his shackles, from the chains, and they love Rearden, and it's very touching. It's so just, the justice. But I know we have limited time, so I was thinking we should move to the romantic relationship with Dagny.
Yeah, we'll do that in a second, and I'll turn it back to you.
But I think we got to say something about Atlas Shrugged, right? Because that's actually where that enters the novel, is when Francisco articulates that image to Rearden. So in a way, Rearden is the one who's there when Francisco talks about the Atlas and what would you tell him to do? And I don't know, what would you tell him? And then he tells him, and then we're saved by the bell. We have the furnace breakout and the action and so on. But I think it's part of who Rearden is in the book, is that he's the one for that speech. Yeah. What would you say to him? If you saw holding the world with the last bits of his strength. Yeah.
That's a good point, Shoshana. That's right. That's the title sequence, for the whole novel is, and Rearden just perfectly typifies the atlases that John Galtstrike is meant to redeem and rescue.
I just wanted to mention just a few other scenes quickly, and then we can move over to Dagny. Then the road is clear. but at Jim's wedding, when Francisco's giving his speech, and then Hank wants to speak with him, and he says, "Who do you think I have been speaking to all this
Yes.
time?" Also, the blowout in the mill, that's when Hank realizes that Francisco is still the same person. He's not this playboy. And, you know, also with the riots at the mill. But so anyway, I just wanted to bring those scenes up too. And
yeah,
then,
but you see, it also, I mean, it's a great thing that, you know, you saved my life, you saved my furnace. But what happened there is that right after Professor Francisco explains things, there's this problem in the furnace and he goes right to work.
yeah.
Just saying, you know,
Right.
and well, let's just say that keeps that he's helping to keep that you know, Rearden's work alive.
Exactly.
And from the bigger picture,
He shouldn't be
this
doing
is not right. And yet
Right.
I don't think that we see, oh, you know, bad boy Francisco, you shouldn't do that, because, you know, it's
well, John Galt himself breaks down at the end too and violates his
Right.
right.
So Andy, you want to move to the mind-body split?
Sure. Sure. And also, what, you know, when Rearden saves Francisco's life at the furnace breakout, you see again, you see how much Rearden loves Francisco. It's in that one, for that one moment, he's the older man, you know, because he's being mentored. It's almost as if he were the younger man. But this moment, he's the older man, like, saving the life of the son, you know, that he loves, and it's again one of many very touching moments in Atlas Shrugged, and, you know, and in the Rearden Francisco love relationship, if I can, you know, call it that, because it is. But in the romantic love relationship with Dagny, of course, you know, Dagny is very healthy on this. The mind body integration that Ayn Rand, you know, emphasizes here, that she realizes, you know, that her sexual attraction, the intense sexual attraction she feels for Rearden, is not just a physical feeling. The physicality, of course, is part of it. You know, Rearden's a real manly kind of guy, but it's more than that. There's a lot of tall, lean, powerful guys, and, you know, physically powerful guys in the world. Just like in Dominique's universe, there's a lot of, you know, tall, lean, powerful guys. Rock's not the only one. But Dagny realizes, you know, that the basis of her intense sexual attraction this is Hank bleeping Rearden, for God's sake. I mean, this is the guy who the best steel manufacturer in the world. This is the inventor of Rearden metal. This is a productive giant, beyond maybe the productive giganticness of all the other productive giants in the story. This is Hank Rearden. This is, you know, in the way that Ayn Rand, a lot of her fictional characters are philosophic or moral archetypes. You know, Hank Rearden is, you know, you can see, you know, like John Galt stylized to show us rationality, and Ragnar Donnerskjold stylized
Justice.
to be the virtue of justice, you know, correct. And Hank Rearden stylized to be the virtue of productiveness, which Dagny enormously values. So, you know, for her, you know, it's the integration of her values, you know, the intellectual, mental, spiritual, moral values with the bodily attraction. She's very clear on that. That's why she can't take Rearden's, you know, verbal abuse after they make love for the first time. She can't take it seriously. She knows how profoundly mistaken Rearden is.
And she's got such self-esteem that it doesn't rattle her at all. She's just puzzled by it.
Yeah, right. And she knows she's right, you know, and that Rearden's mistaken on this, and that Rearden's tormented by his mistake, and he needs to move off center on this. It's another philosophic error that Rearden's suffering from, and he needs to learn better, and Dagny teaches him. But yeah, Rearden, it's ironic because Rearden is the great master of material reality, and the way he can build stuff. You know, he can, you know, he worked in the ore mines. He could dig the ore out of the ground, and he could make steel, and he could make Rearden metal. He can make material prosperity possible, but he regards all of that as low, base, sinful, ignoble. He's got this. The master of material reality holds a religious metaphysics. You know, the spiritual is pure and clean, and the body is ignoble, and sexual desire is base. It's all animalistic. desires. He could have had St. Paul, for his teacher. This is who he sounds like when he when he abuses both himself and Dagny. Right after they make love, he sounds like you're reading the letters to Paul's epistles in the New Testament. About the flesh. The desires of the flesh are low and base, and Rearden needs to learn, and Professor Dagny Taggart teaches him. There's a
She
lesson.
does.
There's a
Yeah,
lesson here
but also Francisco does.
Yeah.
Says, show me the woman he sleeps with, and I'll show you his evaluation of himself.
Right.
And sex is the most profoundly of all acts, and it cannot be performed for any moment other than his own enjoyment, only in the confidence of being desired and of being worthy of desire. It forces a man to stand naked in spirit and body and accept the real ego as his standard of value. He will be attracted to the woman who reflects his deepest vision of himself, whose surrender permits him to experience, or to faith, a sense of self-esteem. He will admire the woman that's strongest and hardest to conquer, the heroine that will give him a sense of achievement. He does not seek to gain his value, he seeks to express it. And there are no conflicts between the standards of his mind and the desires of his body. So Professor Francisco comes to the rescue again.
And explains it actually, and they're both in love with the same woman, so it's not exactly a coincidence. Now, what I think is interesting with Dagny is that when she first meets Rearden, it's described as something like a version of his reaction to her, because he sees her, and if he had any idea of what a woman should look like, this is it. And then it's Dagny Taggart. Oh, now everything comes into place. Now with Rearden, when she sees him and she finds out who he is, it says it was some version of his reaction, and that she was glad that a face she liked belonged to a person she could admire. But unlike Rearden, who immediately thinks that he needs to, consummate his relationship with this woman, although he doesn't do it, Dagny does not think, okay, what am I going to do about this? She doesn't think that. She just thinks that she enjoys dealing with Rearden, and at some level she would like him to see how she's dressed up, which she thinks he doesn't notice, and he does notice. She would like him to be friendly with her at the party. Not that she's, trying to seduce him or manipulate him, but he's colder than usual.
He's very,
and that's right, because he just can't, Dagny.
He's conflicted.
Yeah, he's conflicted. Now, what changes in terms of Dagny's being ready for what happens at Ellis Wyatt's house is the train ride. Okay, because she is, she's on the train. They're not actually doing the business now, and she's thinking about mind body, which she did not see in conflict, but now it's very, very obvious to her, and it's just beautifully described. And she's even hearing the Halle Concerto in her mind, and she saw Rearden's face above her. She held his eyes, and her head leaned back so that her face lay still on the air under his face. Okay, so basically, you might sort of ask the question of, well, if Rearden has been holding back all this time, what changes? And then I think that what we see there is something changes, even though Dagny is not issuing an invitation to him. Something changes in the way that she is looking at him and thinks about him. Okay, and she says yes. Okay, now here's one of my favorite little bits here, and it is Dagny and Rearden together. The look she saw on his face, this is at Ellis Wyatt, made her know for the first time that she had known this would be the end of the journey. Okay, now this is psychology, right? Think about that. She had, it made her know that she'd known something, so she knew it without knowing it, and now she knows that she knows it.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you could say it. Yes.
You know it wordlessly, or you know it just by feeling, but you never brought it into full focal awareness and made it conscious.
Yeah. Now, Ayn Rand doesn't have to kind of give us a lecture about this, but you read that and you say, okay, she understands, and she realizes that she understood before, but she didn't know what she understood.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where we're going
Right.
with especially, you know, with Hank also, that there are things he knows without knowing that he knows them.
And he blossoms. He goes out and he buys her a stole that looks beautiful. He buys her the jewelry. He sends her flowers. And he said, I always want, or takes her out to an incredibly um, private dining place. I don't mean just them, but, and
Yeah.
he's
Isn't
just,
that fur something
oh,
with
so,
sort of the hint of the Rearden metal color
right,
in it?
it's
I want that. I want that fur.
it's
You know,
just
I mean,
right, but he's growing. He's
yeah.
enjoying that gaiety, and he has the love of his life to spend it on. He's got all this money, but he never really was interested in buying things. Now he has Dagny, and she says, Hank, you're not buying this for me. And he says, no, for me, because I love seeing you in this. And she said, I never knew would look so beautiful in this, paraphrasing, obviously. So he is growing in the ability to embrace, which is a good word, his romance, his romantic love for Dagny and his capacity for romance in his self, and unfettered, meaning it's beginning to untangle with Francisco's help.
One of the things that I think Ayn Rand shows us with Hank Rearden is, you know, the philosophic principle of the mind body dichotomy. You know, he has this, you know, this idea that you know that the mind is the mind is exalted, the mind is pure, the mind is good, but the body, you know, is base, it's low, it's ignoble, its desires are, you know, you know, they're a matter of low living. And you know, I think it's funny because Rearden is the master of material reality. He's the guy. He's the guy's able to make steel better than anybody else. He's the one who invents Rearden metal, which is to steel what steel is to iron. He makes possible so much building, so much positive construction, and yet his view of the material world is low. It's almost as if he was studying with St. Paul, you know, and where you are a couple of blackguards, he says to Dagny, because all we care about is material things, you know, and the desires of the flesh. So so his view of sex then is that it's, you know, it's an animalistic urge. It's low, and he's not connecting it at first. You know, that he has this intense sexual desire, which he considers, you know, animalistic and, you know, and bestial, and yet he's not connecting. You know, well, why do I have this desire for Dagny Taggart, not some other attractive woman? Why hers? Why specifically her? And of course, Dagny understands the nature of her attraction to men like Francisco and Rearden, and through the ministrations of Professor Dagny Taggart and some other, you know, in a number of incidents in his life, and Rearden's own intelligence and honesty, he comes to realize why it's Dagny Taggart that he loves. She is the girl who runs the railroad. She's not just an attractive woman. She's the woman who runs the railroad, does it expertly. She's a brilliant engineer. She's the one who builds the John Gaunt line. She's the one that has the brains and the integrity, you know, the independence of thinking. When the State Science Institute denounces Rearden metal, Dagny, using her, you know, sees with her own eyes and understands with her own brain that this is the greatest thing in metallurgy since the advance from, you know, iron to steel. Now there was a steel age, and now there's going to be a Rearden metal age. And so Dagny understands the mind-body integration here, that her bodily desires are responding to yes, in part to Rearden's, you know, physicality. You know, he's a real manly guy, but in large part to his intellectual achievements, his genius in the field of metallurgy and steelmaking, and his upright moral character. It takes a while for, you know, for Rearden to come to understand that the desires of his body are integrated with his mind, and this is why it's Dagny Taggart that he loves. Beautiful woman, yes, but also, you know, a paragon of genius in railroading and engineering, and of course also morally upright, strength of character. And you have the two, mind and body, or spirit and body integrated. And Rearden's liberation from the mind-body dichotomy, again, is very moving aspect of Atlas Shrugged. He comes to realize and be proud of his sexuality, and then his sexual, very, very romantic relationship with Dagny. He becomes as proud of that as Dagny is of her relationship with him. So it's a great story. And of course, Ayn Rand integrates so much philosophy into it. It's just part of what makes her, in my judgment, the greatest novelist in world literature.
By far.
Yeah, no, I think you did a really good job of explaining how Dagny fits into what you were calling before the liberation of Hank Rearden, that he both understands his own desires from what Francisco has explained and from his own looking at himself. And then there is Dagny, the perfect example of what it means to love someone completely. And of course, he doesn't manage to say it to her directly until, as he says, it's the end of their relationship after the broadcast. And he says then that he should have said it to her at the beginning. But there's a sense in which, as we know from Dagny, she always knew it, even though she knew that he did not know it all the way. And remember, we were talking before about seeing the stations in Rearden's journey, and she sees that too. She sees that he's beginning to understand, and she tries to help him, but we're told she had to help him in every way except words. I think that the kind of explanation that Francisco gives him, which is wonderful for Francisco, it would not work for Dagny to explain things in those terms to him if she even could. So I think it's really interesting the way that this aspect of Hank's characterization is also part of the way that the relationship works.
I think
yeah, guys, just one other thing, which is has to do with Rearden and Francisco. When Francisco was explaining about sex and how the split, mind and body there is related to the split about looking at in business things in the material world as not being spiritual, which is something that Hank suffers from at home. Hank says, well, I never accepted that other wrong premise. And Francisco, who is so on track with explaining what he's saying, we are told misses what Rearden has just confessed. So it's an interesting moment, because it's almost as if Rearden is talking to himself, which is good. You should talk to himself, but he's made that particular connection. And his psychology, he likes learning things, and the things that he learns are important for him. And this is something that he's just learned about himself that fits in with what Francisco was saying, but also was a kind of application of it. I guess one other thing to sort of, we'll talk about Lillian another day, but the interesting thing about Lillian is that he chooses her because he thinks that she appreciates the real Hank Rearden, when in point of fact, she actually goes along with this wrong idea of Hank Rearden's. She says, that she disdains the body. She has no respect for sex. And so, in fact, she is a partner in that less healthy element of Rearden, as well as what he thinks he's choosing her for.
Right, and you're right, Shoshana. We see the mind-body dichotomy in Rearden in regards to his work as well as in regards to his love. It reminds me of a great scene, with Francisco, or young Francisco, early in the story, when he's ravaging through the carcasses of a junkyard, going through these rusted old automobiles, and some friend of Dagny's mother, professor of literature, probably not Shoshana Milgram, but I think it was a professor of literature, says to the Francisco, a young man in your position should be in the library studying the great works of human culture. Culture, yeah, he says. And Francisco responds, well, what do you think I'm doing? And that's not just a smart ass response from the kid. Francisco, at 12 years old, or however old he is, realizes that technology, and science and applied science and building stuff in the world materially is as much part of culture as literature and music and painting. He understands the mind-body integration, and helps Rearden come to see that Rearden's work in steelmaking, Rearden's a genius. He's a genius of steelmaking. He's an Andrew Carnegie type, and the greatest metallurgist in the world. He's the one who who invents Rearden metal, not anybody else. And Francisco helps Rearden to see that making steel and inventing Rearden metal is as spiritual an act, or an intellectual and mental an act, as is Halley's symphonies or Ayn Rand's novels, or it's a much part of human culture and achievement of the mind or the spirit as are the arts.
Yeah, very good point.
Yes.
So
which comes up again when we get to Richard Halley, who understands it too. So everything fits together. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's incredibly integrated. Shoshana, what you were talking about Dagny showing, not telling, that's a theme throughout the book. Francisco gives Hank the words. Dagny shows, just as they do in the Valley, by observation. She shows by her own sexual response or her own actions that sex is good. Not Lily and James Taggart sex, but
I thought that was great.
That isn't even sex. That is. But
it's a great scene, though, Ellen. It really is a great scene.
I would never use the word great, but we'll get to that another day.
Like the Great Depression is great, meaning. Yeah. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
And what you were saying, that the confession too, I want to read that segment because it's so poignant. This is Hank has heard Dagny's radio speech, and it's so bittersweet. I want to say loving. Bitter loving, but he said, Hank is saying to Dagny, you said I wanted him, not I love him. I'll always love you. So he tells Dagny that he'll always love her then. I've always seen you as you are now, that greatness of yours, which you are just beginning to, Dagny says this to him.
Yeah.
I've always seen you as you are now, that greatness of yours, which you are just beginning to allow yourself to show. I've always known it, and I've watched your struggle to discover it. So Hank he's discovered his immense capacity for enjoyment of his life. And it's just such a touching scene. So I don't know, if any final words on his relationship with Dagny, and then we can move on to his relationship with Rania.
And the wet nurse.
Well, I guess and the wet nurse. Yeah. Well, all the way through, Dagny is the one who understands more, and some readers understand what Dagny understands, but some do not. And I teach this novel, and some students are very angry at Hank Rearden because of what he says to Dagny. Okay, and one of the things that I say about that is how, that's kind of interesting. That's what he says. What do we actually see him doing as we move forward in the book? And then Dagny says, I'm an animal just like you. Is Dagny starting to act like an animal? Okay, does this actually define the way these two people are relating to each other? So what else do we need to understand that isn't being told to us through the words of these people? And just one more little thing where you see Dagny trying to help Hank when he gets angry about the Mabaskin who sneers at them, who sneers at him and says, get a fake wedding ring, it'll help some, because in my experience, people don't look at each other the way that you two look at each other if they're married. In this world, you're virtuous or you have pleasure, not both. And Rearden is getting very angry because, well, part of what he's angry about is that he senses the disrespect and the derogatory nature of this comment. On the other hand, it is true that they aren't married. And what does that mean for him when he's married to someone else? So part of his anger is things crashing together. And Dagny, who asked the man to explain why he said what he did, said, says to Hank, think about his explanation sometime and see if you recognize any part of it.
Yeah.
So she could explain it to him, but I don't think that would help.
Yeah.
I don't think that would help, because he needs to he needs not only to see it for himself, but he needs to figure it out for himself with a little help.
Yeah.
You know, with a little help from her and from the totality of their experience.
And yeah, I think, it's a good point, since Ayn Rand is so adeptly, adroitly integrates philosophy into so much of her fiction. Maya Bascom is articulating Kant's ethics. This is Kant in a nutshell, because Kant has a whole, in the groundwork of the metaphysic of morals, his main work in moral philosophy, is a whole tortuous theory that results, all it leads to is the belief that either we could either be virtuous or we could be happy, but we can't be both. And here Maya Bascom, Ayn Rand, brilliantly integrates it into this scene about illicit sex with Rearden and Dagny. And even the way Maya Bascom puts it in his hokey down home way, he says, in this world, lady, either you're virtuous or you're happy. What does he say to her? Not both, lady, not both. So it's a good down home version of Kant's ethics. But I wanted to say about the loss of Dagny, because we all know what romantic heartbreak feels like. To lose the person you love is heartbreaking, and especially you lose someone like Dagny. She's one in a billion. She's extraordinary, and yet at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge the loss, and that's painful, enormously so. But Rearden gained something from this that's even more valuable, and that is what you two were just talking about. His own self-esteem, his own self-love has enhanced dramatically, and his realization that this earth belongs to us. We're the ones who make it possible, and I'm the guy, who makes it possible, and I have, what I should be doing is enjoying my life on earth. And his self-awareness, his self-esteem has grown enormously, and he's let his capacity for joyous living kind of out of the box where he had it, locked up, and now he's able to live more fulsomely, in a more fulfilled life. And part of this is now he's got Francisco as his soulmate relation. Now he's got real closeness with his soulmate brother. And of course, in real life, there are other women who are, maybe not another Dagny, but there'll be other women who are very honest, attractive, very honest, achievers in their field, in psychology, literature, and all kinds of that Ayn Rand doesn't show us in Atlas Shrugged. That would be good, for Hank Rearden, especially Hank Rearden now, when he's so vibrantly and fully alive and able to embrace romantic love and joyous living. Rearden's life is going to take. He's got to mourn, obviously, the loss of his love of Dagny, but his life is about to take an enormous upturn, for the best.
That's absolutely true. He says, and that's why I'm still happy. And I thought, it's not exactly still happy, because you haven't been happy all along.
Right.
Right. But he is still happy about the whole relationship with Dagny. And we're also told that at that time, he holds her up, and it's the strength that had always been there for her to depend on, except that she hasn't. She seemed to be the stronger one, Ayn Rand tells us, but now he's the one holding her up after she's done this broadcast, which was his fault. Right. But also was her choice and their choice together. So, you sort of have to ask yourself, how did Ayn Rand think of one episode to bring everything together for Hank Rearden's story and for the romance, and that the end of it is so celebratory and so rapturous and such a love story at the end, and that he even knows you use nothing but the past tense.
Right.
And it's a great word is the rapturous,
Yes.
That and what I take away from Hank Rearden personally, and I think all of us do, is the whole notion of releasing unearned guilt, to be very discriminating in your own life when you feel guilty. Is this genuine guilt? What is it based on? What are the facts that my guilt is based on, and what are the standards? Or is this that horrible, bogus unearned guilt that comes from the wrong moral code, or is said as hatred of the good for being good, is said from someone who's envious or jealous. And do I accept it? And how to manage that? How to manage that situation? I think just, his relationship with his family of just saying that he's indifferent to them. It doesn't bother him anymore. They're all their sarcastic barbs. So I think that, and in therapy, I would do an exercise where I would induce unearned guilt in a client deliberately once I knew them. And it was on something really small, on the fact that they had their feet on my rug in the office that I told them to move. But I said, remember that feeling, because I could really make big men move back in their chairs away from that rug, afraid to put their feet on the rug. And I said, remember that feeling, because you want to be able to stomp your feet on that rug. You didn't earn any of that guilt. And so train your own minds to do what Hank has learned to do, to release, to recognize, identify, and release unearned guilt.
Well, yeah, it's really true that is an enormous burden on him, because if he did actually earn some guilt for something, and there's a sense in which that Dagny had to make that broadcast, that was his fault, his mistake, and so on. But he's in great shape now to fix that. With unearned guilt, since if you didn't do anything wrong, how can you promise not to do it, whatever it is, again? That's why it's the so to speak, the gift that keeps on giving. You can't get away from it. While earned guilt, it's not.
Earned guilt, you can do most.
Yeah, you can
do something about it, and that's what
you can learn.
Does.
Yeah.
Hank apologizes to Dagny about having attacked her after their first romantic encounter.
We're
he tells her he knows it was wrong. Yeah.
The wet nurse it's such a poignant story. And you learn his name only, as the kid is dying, right? His name is Tony.
Tony.
Tony. And the poor kid, and it's so relevant today, comes out of college with his mind has been, just twisted and confused by the non-learning in college. And he comes to Rearden, to Rearden Steele, and he's a government spy in effect, and he's spying on Rearden. But the kid is honest. And he sees with his own eyes, and he understands with his own brain. He comes to recognize that Hank Rearden is the greatest steel producer in the world. He's a productive genius. He's not this robber baron that needs to be corralled and curtailed by a socialist regime. He's one of the atlases holding the world up, and Tony comes to see this in a long, painful struggle. And even before he's killed defending Rearden's mills against government thugs, it is a heartbreaking scene, or at least such a moving scene when he asks Rearden for a job, and again, the juxtaposition of opposites was that right after Philip Rearden was there imploring Rearden for money. I forget. It's been too long since I've read the novel.
It's not right there, but it is subsequent to. And what I think is so powerful there, of course, is that it's not actually that he's asking. He wants to know if he's looking for affirmation. Right. And since we're talking about Rearden, that's part of what Rearden is in the book, is that he's an inspiration to other people.
Right.
Even before he himself is fully liberated. And so it's kind of a twisted version of the boy on the bicycle, or the boy who wanted to be in music, who loved music, whom we met in the Fountainhead, that he discovers it's all, Tony in his own way had questioned, given up on values. It got all twisted. And then, like the boy who wanted to be in music, he looks and he sees, and then he sees the man who does it. And that's what Rearden means to him. And I think we have the idea that's what Rearden means to the people who work for him, which is what we were talking about before, that he's a businessman, but he refutes some of the nasty sneers about businessmen. And so with the wet nurse, it's not just that he's even in a dishonest job, you could say, but he learned. But Rearden is so clear that he learns.
Right.
Right.
When
No
when the
longer non-absolute.
Yes.
yeah, when the wet nurse asks him about the job, and Rita points out you're tied, by the government. They won't let
Yeah.
you. They won't let you go, and they certainly won't let you work for me, in a private capacity. And the wet nurse yeah, you're right, Shoshana. He's looking for that affirmation. But if you
Yeah.
could, would you hire? It chokes me up.
Yeah.
Even if it was just a cinder sweeper, and Rearden
Yeah.
I'd hire you in a second, and for something much more responsible than the cinder sweeper. And it's such a touching moment, where Rearden acknowledges
And
the
even Rearden is
sexual and moral
touched.
growth. Yeah, Rearden's very
Even tough Rearden is touched by seeing what that boy takes away with him for comfort.
yeah.
Again, he's it's as if he's becoming more alert to people's emotions, because this is, for one thing, he sees this is in a sense, this is a healthy emotion. And when it comes to the emotions in his family, it's almost as if he's better off in a certain sense, without actually knowing what they're thinking, especially when, as it turns out, they're evil.
Right.
Well,
Rearden's becoming
What they're thinking is evil.
right.
Rearden's becoming a much better introspective, right? He's aware of his own emotions. And the most heartbreaking scene, I think, maybe that I've ever read, is when he's carrying the dying Tony up the slag heap after he's been shot by government thugs trying to defend Rearden's mills. And he's thinking, mother cats teach their kittens, how to hunt, and mother birds will teach their fledglings to fly. But human parents send their kids to school to have their survival instrument, their brains just twisted and crushed and destroyed. And it's just in the context of the novel, which shows us that the mind is mankind's means of survival, and Ayn Rand's commentary on the educational system, which is even more appropriate today than it was in the 1950s. It's such a touching scene that who killed Tony. The educational system has a big responsibility for not just the government thugs who shot him, but the educational system that deliberately stunted his mind, and it stunted his means of survival, so that he couldn't survive. They sent him out in the world to try and fly with crippled wings, and it's just
mangled wings.
Crippled, mangled wings. It's just a heartbreaking. And Ayn Rand expresses its justified anger here, moral outrage. It's such a moving and touching way. It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful.
Beautiful scene. So
I'm glad you said that just now. You said Ayn Rand expresses this, because it's Hank. These are Hank's thoughts, and Hank now is actually, in a sense, speaking for Ayn Rand, which doesn't always happen. Sometimes Hank's thoughts have not been in line with what Ayn Rand thinks, but here it's as if he's coming into that outrage is exactly what Ayn Rand would say.
Right. Here's the outrage.
And he's thinking
the educational system that in the Comprachicos, in nonfiction, she presents, in a literal, philosophic nonfiction form. And Rearden is thinking the same things, about the educational system that mangled this poor kid's wings so that he could barely get off the ground.
So you see the enormous response to Hank's capacity once he resolves his contradiction and adopts the proper moral code, the healthy moral code, the egoist one, then you just see his capacity to value and disvalue openly, accurately, and honestly. Whether it's with the wet nurse, he values him so much at this point, and it's such a tender moment, and you feel that sadness. I mean, that's so poignant. Or whether it's with Dagny, he can express his love for her openly. I love you. And he is just, Andy, you mentioned he introspects now, this clarity. He doesn't have that contradiction.
Rearden blossoms.
And that is the gift that you get when you adopt a rational moral code. You get that you're not living straddling the moral fence. You're living in a world where you can breathe easily and you have moral clarity.
Right. And he's so emotionally alive now. He's got the feelings of a father while he's carrying Tony up the slag heap. It's a paternal feeling. He
kisses him. And Tony says, "Do you know what you just did?" It was it was Hank's own idea. And he kisses him and he says, "Yeah, you know what I did, and I'll do it again." And it's not typical Rearden. I don't think he goes around kissing all of his employees, and he hasn't had someone, other than the woman he loves, to kiss forever. And here, because this is someone who tried to save his mills and who paid a price for that, he wants to both save his life and in a sense affirm his spirit and give him what he was looking for when he said, would you hire me? Would you hire me? And here, he's kissing him. And I love you, and I love you. I love what you've become. And in a way, you see, because Rearden himself has gone through this process of unlearning some of the wrong ideas that he's wrongly accepted. Here's the Wetners much younger. And he's gone through that process too, from Professor Hank Rearden.
I know we need to wrap up, and I think what Hank gives me is the change process. How, if you're honest and open and willing to, wanting to love your life, you can resolve contradictions. You can check your premises. Of course, it helps having Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged. And for him, it helps having Dagny, as Andy, you've said, Professor Francisco and Professor Dagny. But so you want final last words, and then we will wrap it up. And we never say goodbye to Hank Rearden because we carry him in us.
Rearden is the one hero in Ayn Rand's novels, preeminently, who changes. He's the one who Rourke is self-contained from the start, and so is Galt. But Rearden in particular, some of the other positive characters change and grow, but Rearden grows enormously. I mean, his philosophic understanding increases enormously. He gives up the subjectivism that enabled him to tolerate the altruism of others and be their slave. He throws that off and liberates himself. He rejects the mind-body dichotomy. Now he's fully able to embrace and be proud of his sexuality and his productivity, as moral virtues, changing, learning, like you said, Alan, learning rational philosophy, starts to live his emotional life. He's becoming much more joyous in his living. It's great. It's great to see. It's great to see Hank Rearden grow in that way.
Yeah. And we see the way that he illuminates so many of the other characters in the book. I mean, he's involved in conflicts with several of the bad guys, including some of the, you might say, secondary bad guys, the business people. We see him directly in conflict with them. And it's almost as if he's a different type of person from those bad businessmen we see. And we see him in alliance with the good business people, that they understand him. So you could almost have a whole story about him just as the great Atlas, and indeed it goes along with that. And there's the whole personal story, and the story of his marriage, and the story of his relationship with Dagny, and his interactions with Francisco, who in Ayn Rand's original idea, she was going to have John Galt basically going out and talking to everybody, and then Francisco became the second lead, and part of Francisco becoming the second lead is the Francisco Danconia Hank Rearden miniseries. So Atlas Shrugged, in a way, John Galt's the one who calls the strike, but Hank Rearden is the one we see very dramatically shrugging.
Right. It's
right.
Wonderful, and that gives us all that desire to shrug off that the pain that we never had to carry, and to pursue our dreams and our values. So thank you both.
Just one last point just occurred to me.
Sure.
Rearden's the unavenged hero, as Galt puts it. And one of the great things in the story is Galt doesn't have to avenge Rearden. Galt is able to rescue and liberate and redeem Rearden while he's still alive. So you're right. He's the preeminent character we see shrugging. You're right, Shoshana. And it's again, the whole integration of Ayn Rand's story is just so brilliant done.
It is. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Okay.
And we are never going to say goodbye to Hank. So it's just a
No.
temporary pause and to be continued. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew Bernstein and Dr. Shoshana Milgram. And I'm Dr. Ellen Kenner.
Thank you,
Thank
Ellen
you.
and Roz, putting this on.
Razi.